You gave, they pulled back. You reached out, they distanced. And somewhere in the middle of that push-pull game, you started questioning your worth. But let's make something clear. You were never the problem. The problem was someone who never fully let you in, but didn't want to let you go either. Avoidants are experts at making you feel like you're too much for wanting basic consistency. They'll flirt with connection but flee from intimacy. They'll breadcrumb you just enough to keep you curious, but never fully commit. But now something's changed. You're done negotiating for love. You stopped asking, stopped texting, stopped waiting. And here's the twist, they notice. They feel that shift in energy, that sudden quiet. That's the sound of your power coming back. They thought you'd always be there. They counted on your patience. But healing makes you unavailable to what once broke you. You're not playing games. You're just finally playing fair with yourself. And now they'll feel the weight of what they took for granted. Not because you're punishing them, but because peace doesn't chase chaos. And real love, it doesn't beg to be chosen. You were never an option. You were just undervalued by someone emotionally unavailable. That distinction matters more than you realize. Because when you feel like someone has treated you as disposable, it chips away at your confidence. It makes you question your instincts, your desirability, your choices. You replay moments wondering what you could have done differently. Maybe if you had been less available. Maybe if you hadn't sent that text. Maybe if you had played a little harder to get. But none of those things would have made a lasting difference, because this wasn't about your effort. It was about their capacity. People who operate from an avoidant attachment style often don't know how to deal with closeness, not because they don't crave connection, but because connection exposes their fear. They live in a world where intimacy feels like pressure and vulnerability feels like danger. So when you show up with your full heart, ready to invest, they feel seen in a way that threatens them. Instead of leaning in, they lean out. Instead of accepting the love you offer, they sidestep it. Create distance, and make you feel like your presence is optional. They start responding slower. They pull back affection. They turn simple emotional needs into accusations of being needy. And what's painful is that this often happens just when you think things are moving forward, just when you feel you've built some kind of foundation. Suddenly you're questioning whether that progress was real, whether the late-night conversations meant anything, whether the chemistry was all in your head. It wasn't. It was real, but their emotional availability wasn't, and that's not something you can fix. Being undervalued by someone avoidant is especially confusing because they're rarely cruel. They don't lash out. They don't say anything obviously disrespectful. They just slowly withdraw, little by little, until the connection feels hollow. You might find yourself making excuses for them, telling yourself they're just busy or tired or overwhelmed. But in reality, they're managing their discomfort with intimacy by deprioritizing you. They're soothing their internal fears by keeping you at arm's length. And in doing so, they put you in the deeply unfair position of always trying to prove your worth. But here's the truth that people don't say enough. You were never less lovable just because someone couldn't love you properly. Being in a dynamic with someone who struggles with avoidance doesn't mean you were too much. In fact, the very things that make you a great partner, your consistency, your emotional depth, your openness, are often the things that trigger avoidance the most. They want intimacy, but don't know how to hold it. So instead of growing into it, they back away from it. That backing away can take many forms. Sometimes they become hot and cold. One day deeply engaged, the next emotionally absent. Other times, they create conflict where there is none, just to create distance. They might minimize the relationship, dismiss the label, or avoid conversations about where things are going. This inconsistency keeps you in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing where you stand, always guessing what version of them you'll get next. And that emotional whiplash, it's not your fault. It's a symptom of their avoidance, not your value. When you're being treated like an option, it doesn't mean that's what you are. It means someone doesn't have the capacity to meet you where you are. It means someone is trying to regulate their own fears by downplaying your importance. And if you stay in that space long enough, you start to internalize the story that you have to earn your place in someone's life. That love is a test you have to keep passing. But love doesn't work like that. Someone who truly sees your value doesn't keep you in limbo. They don't make you feel like expressing care is a burden. They don't punish you for wanting clarity or affection or consistency. But when you're with someone who's emotionally unavailable, all of those normal desires get flipped on you. Suddenly you're too intense. You're pushing. You're ruining the vibe. And before you know it, you've shrunk yourself down just to stay acceptable in their eyes. What you have to understand is that being undervalued by someone avoidant isn't a reflection of your shortcomings. It's a reflection of what they're afraid to face. It's easier for them to sabotage something meaningful than to lean into the vulnerability that real connection demands. It's easier to push you away than to sit with the discomfort of being truly seen. So they do what they've always done: disconnect, downplay, and disengage. Avoidants mistake distance for power until silence becomes your strength. In the world of emotionally unavailable people, closeness feels like a loss of control, so they distance themselves, not always as a conscious strategy, but as a reflex rooted in fear, past experiences, and a belief that attachment equals danger. When you show genuine interest or express your emotions, they don't see it as intimacy, they see it as pressure. And pressure to them means vulnerability. Vulnerability means being seen. And being seen, that feels like weakness. So what do? They pull back. They take space. They delay responses. They keep their feelings vague. They communicate just enough to keep you hopeful, but never enough to give you clarity. This gives them a sense of power. It's like they're always a step ahead emotionally, never fully investing, never fully committing. They think if they control the pace of the connection, if they stay emotionally elusive, they stay in control. They stay safe. It's not about hurting you intentionally. It's about protecting themselves from the possibility of needing you too much. Because to need someone in their mind is to lose autonomy. So they create space as a defense mechanism. But that space, that distance, they mistake it for strength. They think by caring less, they're winning. They think by withholding, they're preserving the upper hand. The tragedy is that the dynamic becomes so imbalanced. You're the one reaching out. You're the one initiating conversations. You're the one giving reassurance while getting crumbs in return. You begin to wonder if silence is your fault, if their pullback means you did something wrong, if maybe you're not as important to them as they once made you feel. But the truth is, their emotional distance isn't a sign of your failure. It's a pattern they bring into every connection that starts to feel real. And unfortunately, the more you try to close the gap, the more they pull away. Not because you're wrong to try, but because they interpret closeness as a threat, not a gift. Avoidants don't know how to meet consistency with appreciation. They meet it with retreat. They meet it with delay. They meet it with a cooling off that makes you feel like you've done too much when really all you did was show up. And they assume that as long as they keep just enough connection alive, just enough affection, just enough communication, you'll stay. They believe the power lies in keeping you emotionally hungry, keeping you wondering. They rely on you wanting the relationship more than they're willing to give. That's how they preserve their illusion of power. They believe silence keeps them safe, that if they keep you guessing, they'll never be the one to lose. But something shifts when you stop playing that role, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop chasing clarity from someone who benefits from your confusion. Your silence at that point becomes more powerful than anything you could have said, because silence is not the absence of care, it's the absence of permission. You no longer permit the dynamic where they get to dictate how close or how distant you're allowed to be. You no longer reward inconsistency with patience. You stop translating their avoidance into a personal mission to prove your worth. And that silence, that stillness, it disrupts their entire strategy. They begin to feel the weight of your absence in the space where your presence used to live. They don't hear from you like they used to. You're no longer filling the gaps, no longer initiating connection, no longer making the effort they once took for granted. And for the first time, they're the ones who feel off balance. Not because you did anything loud or dramatic, but because you stopped responding to their silence with noise. You stopped engaging in the chase. You stopped trying to earn something that should have been mutual. That silence isn't punishment, it's your boundary. It's your recognition that emotional distance shouldn't be rewarded with emotional labor, that love isn't supposed to feel like a transaction where one person is always paying the emotional bill. Avoidants operate on the belief that the less they invest, the more valuable they become, that their distance makes them more desirable. But what they fail to understand is that real connection doesn't thrive in power games. It thrives in safety, in presence, in consistency. When you remove yourself from the dynamic, they don't just lose attention, they lose the control they thought distance was giving them. They don't chase love, but they will feel the loss when you stop showing up. People with avoidant tendencies often live in a paradox. They want connection, but fear the intimacy it requires. They crave closeness, but only in carefully measured doses they can emotionally control. So when someone begins to care about them deeply, when love starts to take form through consistency, patience, and emotional availability, they instinctively begin to pull back. Not because the love isn't real, but because it is. And that realness threatens the walls they've spent years building. They don't know how to sit in emotional presence. It feels too exposed. So they sidestep it, they keep things ambiguous, they avoid defining the relationship. They give you just enough affection to keep hope alive, but not enough to build anything real. They expect you to fill in the blanks, they let you initiate, let you lead, let you love loudly, while they maintain a calculated silence. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to care in a way that feels vulnerable. Their avoidance tells them that love is safest when it's kept at a distance, when it's never fully acknowledged. That way, if it ends, they can pretend it never really started. But here's where the story shifts. Because while avoidants don't often chase love, they do feel its absence. They may not admit it, they may not say the words, but the emotional hole left behind when you stop showing up, when you stop texting first, stop checking in, stop holding space, becomes undeniable. You were their emotional safety net, the constant they could rely on while they pretended not to rely on anyone. And when that net disappears, they begin to notice the quiet. They notice that the comfort they used to resist is gone, that someone who used to care, used to try, used to fight for them, no longer does. At first, they might not react. Avoidants are masters at pretending nothing affects them. They'll act like it's fine, like your absence doesn't faze them, like you've simply faded into the background of their lives. But that's just the mask. Underneath, something has shifted. The space you once filled now echoes. Your messages aren't lighting up their phone anymore. Your presence isn't buffering their loneliness anymore. And slowly, they realize they were never as unaffected as they tried to be, because what they had with you wasn't ordinary. And now that it's gone, they can't replicate it with something casual or half-hearted. Avoidants don't chase love because they're terrified of what that chase requires. Chasing means admitting you care. It means being seen, being open, taking emotional risks. And those are all things they've spent their life trying to avoid. They've learned to keep themselves guarded, to associate attachment with loss or control or pain. So when love starts to grow, instead of embracing it, they create space to manage it. But once that love is no longer accessible, once the one person who kept showing up stops showing up, their emotional equilibrium is disrupted. They begin to feel the weight of something they thought they didn't need. They remember your warmth, your patience, your energy, your ability to understand them without judgment, and they realize that what they took for granted wasn't ordinary, that what they let slip wasn't replaceable. But by the time that understanding sets in, the dynamics have changed. You're no longer available in the way you once were. You're no longer emotionally invested in waiting for someone to decide if you're worth choosing. That emotional gap they once used to maintain power is now the very space that holds their regret. Avoidants underestimate the value of emotional consistency. They underestimate how much someone's care can shape their daily life, even when they act indifferent. They don't chase love because they think staying in control will protect them. But what they fail to see is that real love is never about control. It's about courage. The courage to show up, to let someone in, to risk the messiness of intimacy for the beauty of connection. So when they feel your absence, it's not just about missing a person. It's about confronting their own emotional limitations. They're left facing what they never wanted to face, that they pushed away someone who was willing to stay, that they sabotaged something rare, not because it wasn't right, but because they were scared it might be. And now the silence they once used as a shield has become a mirror reflecting back everything they didn't want to lose. Your glow up isn't revenge, it's recovery. After being with someone who treated your love like an inconvenience, your care like a threat, and your emotional availability like something to run from, it's easy to feel like the only way to heal is to prove them wrong, to make them see what they lost, to finally be the version of yourself they regret letting go. But that mindset, as tempting as it is, keeps you tethered to their story. True recovery doesn't happen because you want them to notice. It happens because you realize you no longer need their validation to feel whole. When someone with avoidant tendencies walks away or slowly disappears from your life, they often do it with the silent confidence that you'll be stuck, that you'll stay waiting, wondering, hoping they'll come back around once they're ready. They believe they hold emotional power because they were never fully present to begin with. And for a while, they might be right. You do feel stuck. You miss the connection. You replay every conversation. You blame yourself for things you couldn't control. You wonder why you weren't enough for them to choose fully. You try to make sense of how someone could pull you in and then detach without explanation. But that pain, that confusion, it becomes the beginning of something else, something more powerful. It becomes the moment you stop trying to be chosen by someone who couldn't even choose themselves. You begin to realize that your worth was never tied to their ability to recognize it, that their inability to love you in the way you deserved isn't a reflection of your inadequacy, but of their avoidance. And that shift, that internal recognition, it becomes the spark that lights your recovery. Your glow-up begins in the small, quiet decisions you make for yourself. When you choose to redirect the energy you spent analyzing their behavior into building your own confidence. When you stop checking their social media and start checking in with your own growth. When you catch yourself in the spiral of self-blame and choose compassion instead. Recovery isn't loud. It's not always glamorous. Sometimes it looks like waking up and finally not thinking about them first thing in the morning. Sometimes it's setting boundaries where you once let everything slide. Sometimes it's making peace with the idea that closure won't come from them. It has to come from you. It's in these moments that your glow-up starts to take shape. Not as a performance, not as a show, but as a byproduct of healing. You start taking care of your body, not because you want them to regret losing you, but because you're reconnecting with it after neglecting it in emotional survival mode. You start surrounding yourself with people who reflect the energy you gave so freely. You start laughing again, really laughing, not because everything's perfect, but because you're no longer carrying the weight of trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. Avoidants often expect people to stay emotionally tethered to them even after they pull away. They're used to disappearing and reappearing without consequence. They count on the loyalty of the people they kept at arm's length. But when you start to glow, when you reclaim your sense of self, when you become unavailable to the emotional games, they feel it. Not because you're flaunting your growth, but because your energy has changed. You're no longer sending messages they don't respond to. You're no longer filling the silence with explanations. You're no longer orbiting their life, hoping to be let back in. That emotional withdrawal, that shift in your focus, it speaks louder than any words ever could. The power in your recovery is that it's not about them anymore. It's about coming home to yourself. It's about realizing that you were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. That someone's fear of connection doesn't make your desire for intimacy wrong. That your emotional depth is a strength, not a flaw. The more you invest in yourself, the clearer this becomes. You're no longer trying to fit into someone's limited capacity for love. You're expanding into your own. And that expansion, that self-actualization, it's not meant to be witnessed by the person who couldn't meet you. It's meant to be lived fully, whether they ever see it or not. Because this version of you, the one who chose healing over chasing, growth over grief, clarity over chaos, is not a comeback story. It's who you were always becoming, once you stopped shrinking to fit inside someone else's fear. The moment you stop fighting to be seen by someone who only sees themselves, you begin to reclaim your peace. Being in a dynamic with an avoidant partner can feel like constantly proving your worth in a space where your love is both desired and feared. They might have enjoyed the comfort of your presence, the warmth of your care, the stability of your loyalty, but they never truly let themselves receive it. They couldn't. Because to truly receive love, you have to let your guard down. You have to be willing to step into emotional territory that's unfamiliar and unpredictable. And for someone avoidant, that's not only uncomfortable, it's threatening. Avoidants often operate from a deep-rooted need to self-protect. Somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness leads to loss, that needing someone is a vulnerability they can't afford. So they move through relationships with caution, often confusing control with safety. They show up halfway, give pieces of themselves, and then withdraw the moment it feels too real. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's unconscious. But the result is the same. You feel invisible in moments when you most deserve to be held. And so you fight. Not always loudly, but internally. You try harder, you offer more, you show patience, you speak gently. You lower your expectations just to match what little they're able to give. You tell yourself they need time, that they're different, that you just have to be the exception to their rules. You end up trapped in this cycle of trying to unlock their love, hoping that if you just say the right thing or love them the right way, they'll finally let you in. But every time they pull away again, you feel it, that sting of being invisible, that ache of not being chosen, that confusion of how someone could feel so close and so far at the same time. What begins to shift everything is the realization that love shouldn't feel like a negotiation. It shouldn't require you to shrink, silence yourself, or prove over and over that you're worthy of basic emotional presence. It's one thing to support someone who's healing. It's another to constantly excuse behavior that hurts you just because someone hasn't confronted their own emotional fears. When you find yourself exhausted from loving, when being in the connection drains your joy more than it feeds your soul, that's not love. That's emotional labor disguised as loyalty. You start to realize that the peace you're craving can't exist in a relationship built on unpredictability. Peace comes when you no longer tolerate emotional inconsistency as your normal. Peace comes when you stop trying to be the exception for someone who isn't ready to meet anyone halfway. And that peace starts with acceptance, not of their behavior, but of your worth. You begin to accept that you deserve more than fragments, that you are not difficult for wanting clarity, consistency, and intimacy, that your needs are not demands, they are boundaries, and boundaries are not punishments, they're protection.